Stories from the Homefront, The War in Wisconsin, is made possible by the Kappen-Gerlach Foundation, the Harry and Mary Franke Idea Fund, the National Center for Outreach, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and funded in part by a grant from the Wisconsin Humanities Council with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the State of Wisconsin.
It's sort of just, you're changed in a way. You're never the same.
World War II was the second major war of the 20th century, and the deadliest. From Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 to Japan's surrender in 1945, more than 100 million military personnel were called into action. More than 50 million lives were lost, about a third of those civilian casualties. Over 300,000 Wisconsin soldiers served during the war.
We all knew we had to go to war. They took us right out of our class.
Everybody, well, I can't wait till I'm 18 to go to the military and, fight the Japs.
Wisconsin citizens actively participated in the war effort, facing the changes and challenges of everyday life.
We had to stick together because somebody's car would break down and there were no parts, no tires, no batteries to get to where you're going.
It was a treat to have bacon and eggs on Sunday. That was a Sunday special. But Mom saved the bacon grease in a special container, and then during the week we would have bacon fried eggs.
But even with the shortages, Wisconsin and Milwaukee prospered.
Before the war, Milwaukee was one of the most industrialized cities in the country. It was a place of both large corporations like Alice Chalmers and A.O. Smith, but it was also a place of small machine shops. It was a place of a large number of skilled crafts, so that you had an industrial workforce that could effectively shift gears, so to speak, from the production of peacetime, whether it be automobiles or water heaters or whatever it might be, to producing the material of war.
As the war dragged on, more men got drafted into military service, opening industries' doors to others.
One of the most studied areas of the change in the workforce is what happens with women workers. They tend to go from either the home or from retail into industrial production.
There were about 4 of us that went, and we worked at Case because they were making Bombay doors and wings for planes. And I was Rosie the Riveter then, and I was 17. They really needed a lot of people because there were no men left. So when they just showed us how to do it, and this is the way we do it, and that was it. We'd put in an 8-hour day or whatever it was. We couldn't tell anyone what we were doing. We knew but we didn't know what that part was. If anyone asked us, we didn't know. They just told us what to do. There was one woman, a young woman, we were all very young, and she got a telegram saying that her husband was killed. And that put such a bad feeling for everybody. It was horrible. She was only 19. send a telegram to him saying that our child was born. And he was in Nancy, France, so we named her Nancy. But he never got the telegram. He saw it in the Stars and Stripes.
Women very much are doing two jobs during the war. They're working for pay in industry or maybe in retail, but they're also coming home and cooking dinner, maybe looking after the kids if it's 1944.
My mother had died when I was 8. I became a homemaker at 13, and so I had a lot of things to deal with facing how to deal with cooking and being a homemaker at a very, very early age, plus on National Avenue, and it was part of the USO.
That was a real start for women, I think. And it changed their attitudes, it changed their positions. Women who had literally just cooked and raised kids and sewed and cleaned were now recognized as being able to do a lot more. And I think it was the first step toward women. I had taken a bus out to Kinnickinnick Avenue, where this place was, and I was supposed to watch the bar, and I was also pregnant. So I rode the streetcar down from Oakland and Capitol down to South Kinnickinnick.
The war had special implications for Louise and her family.
I remember the oncoming of the whole Jewish problem, because I happen to be Jewish. And we began to hear about the Holocaust and its beginnings, and just words that would get through, but most of the time we just couldn't figure out that it could possibly be true.
Louise's brother, Monty, enlisted when the war broke out. Toward the end of 1944 came the news that families dread. Monty had been killed in a plane crash.
I was pregnant with my second child, and we just got the word that they had crashed, and they didn't expect that anybody was alive, but they'd keep in touch. And my father's hair turned white in about 2 weeks. My mother was phenomenal and held on, and we all just were waiting for word. And they were over at the house with my first kid, and the phone rang, and it was somebody saying that Monty was okay.
At the end of the war, when the soldiers return, many women leave the workforce, but not all. Louise Yaffe leaves to raise her family. Alvina Kavanaugh stays until the birth of her son. Rose Truckee changes occupations, eventually becoming vice president of a bank.
A number of authors talk about the fact that the World War II is this watershed event for women workers. It's the event that starts, in a sense, the modern women's movement. And I disagree with that basic perspective. If you look at the statistics, there is a major blip during the war when women enter the workforce in very large numbers. But if you take that blip out, there's a steady progression over time. So that what's really happening is, well before World War II, women are entering the workforce and there's this steady progression. The other thing, and it really reflects the nature of women's work and employment during the war, there's this broad assumption, I think, in the American populace that women enter the workforce for the first time in World War II, and that just isn't true.
The war also opened industry's doors for African Americans. Blacks started being hired to work in industry around the beginning of the 20th century. But black employment in factories was cyclical. They would be hired and then let go and hired again. World War II would change that.
I think, in fact, we could say that World War II did a number of things for blacks. For one thing, it sort of created conditions under which African Americans who had been sort of mired in unemployment at disproportionately high levels were able finally to gain reemployment.
When the war started, when I turned 16, you could be hired to work in the factories. And the thing is, get a job to defeat the Japs, you know. So I was a forklift driver at Ellis Chalmers. They had a counselor at school, and he said, if you're 16 years old, you can work in the summer, you know, in a factory or something. And you had to have a work permit, of course. The parents okay, we did. Many of us did. And that was my first job. And I felt very proud of, you know, being able to work during the summer and really help.
A few companies, like Alice Chalmers, hired blacks, but most did not.
When I got to A.O. Smith, there was this guy who checked us in, or gave us our orientation, who told us, don't you let nobody shove no mess on you. You're just as good, you're a United States citizen, you're just as good as anybody else is. And I often wondered what happened to that guy after the war was over, because it didn't turn out to be that way. Nobody was as good as anybody else if your skin was tinged with
Washington movement really made the point that World War II, for all of the benefit that it had sort of brought in terms of opening up opportunities for workers to enter industry, that for black workers, it would not be automatic. That even in the case of vacancies and a cry for labor, industrialists were not hiring black people, even though they claimed that they're
Chalmers at that time if I wanted to, but my goal was to, to go to college. That was my dream.
Bob used the GI Bill to realize his dream, taught school and coached athletics. The gains that African Americans made in industry helped the black community expand from 10,000 residents in 1945 to over 100,000 by 1970.
We had relatives that came from the South, many other families too had relatives came because they heard about the jobs. It was a long train ride, but once they got here, they were employed for many years. Many retired from these factories.
One of the lesser-known stories of World War II involves the large number of POWs shipped from Europe to America during the latter years of the war.
Most states had POW camps. The reality is we had about 450,000 enemy soldiers that we brought back here, and we had to put them somewhere. And what they were doing was just putting them in, initially at least, into pre-existing camps. The first was at McCoy, where we had an old CCC camp, an abandoned CCC camp. So we put them there. That was our first. And then they were putting them in military bases and in little camps here and there, all across the country. We did get more than our share, I suppose, because we ended up with about 20,000 for our state. But that was, it was common to have them in most states.
Wisconsin housed prisoners in 39 camps spread around the state, usually in small communities.
They did not want the public to know for a couple of reasons, and they made a lot, well, obviously one would be security, but that wasn't a real big issue here. But they were afraid that might panic civilians, and they didn't want revenge.
Well, they did the work of what most of our men and military.
And they were talking funny. And it was, I couldn't understand them, but my girlfriend knew because her grandma was from Germany, so she knew they were speaking German. And then when we spoke to them, they didn't respond except for one. And one man came forward, and it was just kind of interesting. And then we saw the, if I remember right, they may have had food trays, and it looked like not a very generous meal for knowing the kind of hard work they were doing. At any rate, because of that, it was a time when our moms would put cookies and cupcakes on the windowsills, because moms baked every day then, you know, at least in our families. And so we'd snitch stuff and take them to the guys. Well, you never saw such big smiles on these people who were so stony-faced before.
In World War II, I worked at the canning factory every summer, of course, and that's all I knew was the canning factory. And in 1944, we got our first German war prisoners. They were housed in Chilton at the fairgrounds.
Richard Hipke worked for his family's canning factory.
They were Rommel's troops that were captured in North Africa. And some of them were from the Hitler Youth Movement. And I said "Mach schnell" many times. And they didn't like it. But we had guards walking around the plant, with one of them was a submachine gun, but I don't think it was loaded.
But the most interesting and probably most depressing in some ways was the girl problems. That was the biggest problem for the military camp commanders, was to keep the girls out. Now if you think about that, they're the only guys in town. Our men are all gone, okay? And so here these women, and here's these good-looking guys.
We got letters from them to get, some of them fell in love with some of the girls working in our plant. So we got mail. Now we got to forward this mail to these girls.
Except that you had to go back to the camp at night.
Kurt Peckman was drafted into the German Army in 1940. He served on the Russian front, was captured, and came to the United States in 1943. One of his stops in Wisconsin had his detail picking onions.
The farmer figured, well, if we get half of it done in 2 days, he would be happy. We went to work and we got the whole acres, I believe 2 acres of what was picking onions by hand in a good half a day. And he gave us a feast, more than he should have, more than was allowed. He gave us A1 food. He had white table there, and some neighbors came there and serving food also, and like on a wedding. We had beer, we had schnapps, that was against the law, see, but he gave it to us anyhow, see, and he was so happy because no matter where we worked, actually, there was no complaints ever that the POWs did not behave.
Prisoners of war were usually shipped stateside. Milwaukeean Ed Green, a member of the Coast Guard, was stationed aboard the USS General W.H. Gordon, one of the ships that carried troops to Europe and brought prisoners of war back to the United States.
One of our big jobs, we carried thousands, literally thousands of German prisoners back, one after the other and everything, and about 500 or more in one load. I found contact with the German prisoners to be very good, and talked with dozens upon dozens of them. I mentioned to one fellow, I was talking to him, I talked to him quite a bit, and he hung around the carpenter shop, and he was almost exactly my age. And he was fought along with Rommel in North Africa. And I says, boy, your diction is just perfect. I says, you have a vocabulary and so forth, and you elucidate the words, and your pronunciation is letter perfect. He says, I'm a Harvard graduate. I said, what are you doing in a Wehrmacht? And he says, well, when I completed school, my folks still lived in Germany. So after I graduated, I just went back to Europe and immediately wound up in the Wehrmacht. And he says, like you, probably none of us were overly happy about the war, but it's one of those things.
At the end of the war, the prisoners were repatriated. Many sought to come back to the United States and asked the farmers they had worked for to write letters of support.
A lot of those farmers with this correspondence said, yeah, you worked hard for me before, you can come and I'll sponsor you. And we know nationwide of at least 5,000 that came back. And I know about 30 that came back here from Wisconsin, and I'm sure I don't know anywhere near all of them.
Harry Hetz finished his medical studies in Europe and returned to the U.S. He served a medical internship, settled in the Chicago area, and was then drafted into the United States Army.
When I became a licensed physician and surgeon, I was eligible for military service. Well, this was then in 1955. See, the Korean War was over.
Kurt Peckman came back to Wisconsin and started his own business in Madison, Peckman Memorials. He began to earn a reputation for designing and building memorials for American veterans.
I figured myself a friend of the American veterans. And that's why I gave them all the good big discounts. And that got around to see, and then I don't know who was in charge of it at that time, but they had a big ceremony there. I believe Mr. Toki was involved in it too. I was invited to the VFW hall here, and then had a great big celebration, and here I got the American Purple Heart. And I can't believe it that the ex-German prisoner of war gets American Purple Heart. I cried when I got it, because as an ex-POW, that's the only one in American history that ex-POW gets American Purple Heart. So, and I'm, can you